Learning objectives. In this chapter, the user would learn the following in detail: conventional photography, file formats and quality settings, digital exposure, creative control of aperture and shutter speeds, exposure evaluation, low light photography, controlling white balance and other aspects in camera, composition and lens choice, digital imagery, digital image scale, scanning analog photographs, features of DSLR video and still cameras, use of features for realization of different effects. Conventional photography. It is more difficult but still possible to obtain good results with conventional photographic equipment. Equipment. Use an SLR camera with close-up lenses or extension tubes. TTL, through the lens metering, is a must. Extension tubes work better than close-up lenses, but both are acceptable. Flash must be separate from the camera to light eggs and small larvae correctly. Attach a piece of foam to the flask to diffuse and reduce the light. Use a dark green background. Matting from a Photoshop works well. Techniques. Shoot a test roll with a backdrop to determine exposure setting. Use ASA 100 film. Shoot prints if you want to scan photos to a computer. Very time-consuming. Remove feeding larvae, food plant and all, from their containers and photograph them against the green background. Photograph butterflies on their food plants in the laboratory setting. Do not chill butterflies except as a last resort, as often they will flop about on the ground as they warm up, damaging the wings and ruining the photo. File formats and quality settings. File formats. Including proprietary types, there are hundreds of image file types. The PNG, JPEG, and GIF formats are most often used to display images on the Internet. These graphic formats are listed and briefly described below, separated into two main families of graphics, raster and vector. Quality settings. The quality setting you use determines the amount of compression your camera applies to the image. SHQ or fine quality means low compression, whereas SQ or low quality means high compression. High quality equals low compression equals great image equals high space requirement. The high quality setting will give you a great looking image, but also takes more space on your memory card. Low quality equals high compression equals poor image equals low space requirement. The low quality setting will save you lots of storage card space so you can get more shots, but at the sacrifice of picture quality. Digital exposure. There are three properties which are the primary motivation behind the various exposure techniques. Progressively darker tones have correspondingly higher image noise. Progressively brighter tones are unrecordable beyond a certain intensity, causing textures to turn solid white, clipped highlights, or individual color channels to saturate. Incomplete use of camera's dynamic range reduces the number of recorded tones, and this problem is compounded by the fact that cameras capture disproportionately fewer dark tones compared to how we see with our eyes. The key is knowing how to control one's exposure to take advantage of these unique characteristics. Ideally, one would capture using a standard exposure that records the brightest tones possible, but without clipping. However, this isn't always practical, since one often doesn't know how precise distribution of tones before pressing the shutter button. Taking a second photo isn't always an option, and fitting a standard exposure within the camera's dynamic range might not even be possible in the first place. Expose to the right, ETTR, Introduction. Strategy. Aim to expose the image so that its histogram shifts as far to the right as possible, without clipping the highlights, even if this results in overexposure. A negative exposure compensation is later applied during RAW development to get the image back to a standard exposure. Advantages: maximizes the number of tones recorded. Note: many recent digital SLR cameras have RAW files which record tones with 14-bit precision, so this is less of a factor than it used to be. It is highly unlikely that a RAW image will have insufficient tones and become posterized as long as it isn't grossly underexposed. Minimizes image noise because lighter and therefore less noisy tones get darkened after exposure compensation is applied. The total reduction in noise will depend on how much the photo is able to be overexposed without clipping. Disadvantages: has a high risk of clipping the highlights, especially in the individual color channels, which can lead to unrealistic color shifts. Requires more light than normal and potentially a higher ISO speed, which could mitigate any reduction in image noise from ETTR. Makes judging or pruning photos more difficult since subjects will likely appear overexposed until exposure compensation is applied in post-processing. May require several shots followed by histogram inspection in order to position the histogram as intended. One also needs to look at the color histogram in order to avoid clipping in any of the individual color channels. Slightly underexposure. Strategy: aim to slightly underexpose the image by using a negative exposure compensation, perhaps about -1/3 to -1/2 stops in the camera itself. A positive exposure compensation is later applied during RAW development to get the image back to a standard exposure. Advantages: safeguards against blown highlights and clipped color channels. Requires less light than normal, potentially enabling a lower ISO speed, which would offset any increase in image noise. Disadvantages: increases image noise because darker and therefore noisier tones get brightened after exposure compensation is applied. Images will likely appear darker than intended when viewing them in the camera. Fewer discrete tones are captured by the camera. Use correct exposure in camera. A correct exposure is typically obtained whenever a middle gray tone within your scene gets recorded as a middle gray tone on the image histogram. However, there isn't always a correct exposure for every scene, since this also depends on your artistic intent, particularly for night and low light photos. Advantages: images will likely have the intended brightness straight from the camera. This makes post-processing much simpler and allows one to more easily judge keepers when viewing them on the camera. Doesn't require that you capture your images using the RAW file format. Disadvantages: still risks clipping the highlights or individual color channels when capturing very high contrast or colorful scenes, especially if the camera's metering mistakenly overexposes a little. Highlight clipping. Sometimes a little highlight clipping is okay and even looks natural. Specular highlights such as reflections on metal or water, regions around the sun such as in sunsets, or other direct light sources such as street lamps, all appear perfectly fine when clipped. This is often the necessary cost of ensuring that everything else is sufficiently bright. In other situations, clipping might not be ideal, but it will likely be unavoidable. Otherwise, excessive noise or detail loss may occur in the darkest regions. In these cases, the difficult part is deciding on how much clipping is acceptable. Also be careful to avoid clipping in the individual color channels, luminosity and color, which can lead to unnatural color shifts if those regions require darkening during RAW development. This can happen very easily when trying to push the histogram as far right as possible. In the example below, even the slightest underexposure was undesirable since the scene contained both bright clouds and extremely dark regions. Accidental color channel clipping. Unnatural color shift when trying to recover clipped regions. Creative control of aperture and shutter speeds. Aperture priority and shutter priority. In both of those modes, you select one aspect of the exposure, the aperture in aperture priority or the shutter speed in shutter priority, and the camera automatically matches this with an appropriate shutter speed or aperture. When you're working in a hurry, it can be easy just to focus on the part that you're manually selecting and neglect to check the setting that the camera has chosen. Sometimes this can lead to disappointing results. Take aperture priority. As you change the aperture, the shutter speed may drop too low to give sharp handheld pictures. Program shift can be a better option for grab shots where there's little time to think. You can press the shutter release and be confident that the camera will always opt for a shutter speed that'll give you sharp results. When it comes to exposure, program modes always plays it safe. The camera takes the focal length of the lens into account when it meters a scene and sets the exposure, and it assumes that you're shooting handheld. As a result, it will attempt to set a fast enough shutter speed to produce sharp pictures free from the effects of camera shake. This means that in low light, it will choose the largest available aperture on the lens to ensure the fastest shutter speed is used. Only when light levels are bright enough will it select a smaller aperture to increase the depth of field and make more of a picture look sharp. While this is good news for grab shots, the combination of aperture and shutter speed set by the camera is unlikely to produce creative results. Low light photography. To take higher quality, low light photos, be sure that you have the equipment that you will need. Use stable platform, that is a tripod. Fairly fast lens. Aperture of f22 would be 1/22, small number, small opening. Aperture of f1.8 would be 1/1.8 and would be wide open, a larger opening. Ability to increase your ISO to a fairly high level, that is 1600 or more. Determine the best times to do outside low light photography. The last half hour before sunrise or after sunset, if taking outside pictures, are the best times. Decide where you will be taking your shots, what you had, and what you might need to ensure a good quality shot. Different types of shots are star trails. Any star trail photography will take from several minutes to several hours, depending on what you want, where you are, and what type of equipment you are using. Light trails, traffic and light painting. Cave photography is not for the faint of heart. Not only are you dealing with very closed-in spaces, but those closed-in spaces are pretty dark. Late night athletic events, evening birthday parties, sunrise or sunset is a great time to get beautiful pictures. Start experimenting and find a basic shot that works for you and expand from there. Start with a low ISO, 100, 200, whatever your camera might allow, an aperture of about f20, pretty small, and shoot for a few seconds using the bulb feature. Start with a higher ISO, open up your aperture a bit, shorten the time. Depending on your camera, find a way to hold open the shutter. You might have to use a remote to start and finish it and a cable release. Experiment with your manual settings. Go completely manual, aperture priority and shutter priority, and get immediate feedback. Really dig into your camera's functions. Exposure bracketing. Your camera will shoot 3 photos of the same shot, one with more and one with less than the programmed exposure. Experiment with different types and viewpoints of light. Front lighting, in the eye. Backlighting, in the lens. Side lighting. 3 things are required: light, composition, and subject. Low lighting. Low-key lighting is a style of lighting for photography, film, or television. It is a necessary element in creating a chiaroscuro effect. Traditional photographic lighting, 3-point lighting, uses a key light, a fill light, and a backlight for illumination. Low-key light. Low-key lighting often uses only one key light, optionally controlled with a fill light or a simple reflector. Low-key light accentuates the contours of an object by throwing areas into a shade, while a fill light or reflector may illuminate the shadow areas to control contrast. The relative strength of key to fill, known as the lighting ratio, can be measured using a light meter. Low-key lighting has a higher lighting ratio, that is 8:1, than high-key lighting, which can approach 1:1. Horror genres. Aim the sensor of the light meter at the camera. Hold the button on the side of the light meter down. Controlling white balance and other aspects in camera. White balance. White balance is an aspect of photography that many digital camera owners don't understand or use, but it's something well worth learning about, as it can have real impact upon the shots you take. Different digital cameras have different ways of adjusting the white balance, so ultimately you will need to consult your camera's manual to work out the specifics of how to make changes. Having said this, many digital cameras have automatic or semi-automatic modes to help you make the adjustments. Here are some of the basic white balance settings you will find on cameras. Auto. This is where the camera makes the best guess on a shot-by-shot basis. Tungsten. This mode is usually symbolized with a light bulb and is for shooting indoors, especially under tungsten incandescent lighting, such as bulb lighting. It generally cools down the color in photos. Fluorescent. This compensates for the cool light of a fluorescent light and will warm up your shots. Daylight. Sunny. Not all cameras have this setting because it sets things as fairly normal white balance settings. Cloudy. This setting generally warms things up a touch more than daylight mode. Flash. The flash of a camera can be quite a cool light, so in flash WB mode, you will find it warms up your shots a touch. Shade. The light in shade is generally cooler, bluer than shooting in direct sunlight, so this mode will warm things up a little. Other aspects in camera. Light tight boxes. Cameras are light tight boxes that admit controlled light only through a lens, creating a series of individual frames as film is moved into place behind the lens. The film is held steady during exposure and then advanced. Conceptually, motion picture cameras haven't changed for more than a century. Focused exposure. Film must be accurately placed, perfectly flat, and remain stationary during exposure for even focused exposure to occur. Timing and accuracy. The timing and accuracy of the aperture must be precise, especially for synchronous sound filmmaking. Even when sound isn't used, any variation in camera speed will affect exposure. Cameras moving. The camera's moving parts must transport the film at virtually any speed required for the cinematographer's desired effect without damaging the film. To prevent unintentional film fog, a camera body must be light-proof. Most cameras use a detachable light-proof magazine to hold large rolls of film, that is 400 feet for 16 mm or 1000 feet for 35 mm. Fixed or variable speed motor. Motors deliver precise frame rates. This drives the sprocketed wheels of the precision movement. On a more advanced camera, the speed is displayed on a tachometer. Movement. The precision movement is directly linked to the rotation of the shutter and manages the flow and timing of the film transport. The film undergoes two exposure cycle phases. Composition and lens choice. Composition in cinematography. Composition is the placement or arrangement of visual elements or ingredients in a work of art. As distinct from the subject of a work, it can also be thought of as the organization of the elements of art according to the principles of art. List of photographic composition techniques. The 6 main techniques are simplicity, photography, symmetrical balance, asymmetrical balance, radial balance, rule of thirds, framing, photography. Rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is a rule of thumb or guideline which applies to the process of composing visual images such as designs, films, paintings, and photographs. The guideline proposes that an image should be imagined as divided into 9 equal parts by 2 equally spaced horizontal lines and 2 equally spaced vertical lines, and that important compositional elements should be placed along these lines or their intersection. History. The rule of thirds was first written down by John Thomas Smith in 1797. In his book, Remarks on Rural Scenery, Smith quotes a 1783 work by Sir Joshua Reynolds, in which Reynolds discusses in unquantified terms the balance of dark and light in a painting. This rule, however, does not supply a general law, but universalizes a particular, the invariable observance of which would produce a uniform and monotonous practice. Lens and optical filter in a camera. A network camera consists of many elements. This presentation is aimed to give you knowledge about the lens and filters that are placed in front of the image sensor on a camera. Filters. IR filter. Light is a form of radiation wave energy that exists in a spectrum of which the human eye can see only a portion, that being the blue to red spectrum. Below the blue is ultraviolet light. Above the red is infrared light. Lens. A camera lens, also known as photographic lens or a photographic objective, is an optical lens or an assembly of lenses used in conjunction with a camera body and mechanism to make images of objects either on photographic film or on other media capable of storing an image chemically or electronically. Type of lens: biconcave lens, biconvex lens, convex-concave lens, plano-concave lens, plano-convex lens, meniscus lens. Laser-engineered net shaping, or LENS, also known by laser powder forming. A high-power laser is used to melt metal powder supplied coaxially to the focus of the laser beam through a deposition head. The laser beam typically travels through the center of the head and is focused to a small spot by one or more lenses. The XY table is moved in raster fashion to fabricate each layer of the object. The head is moved up vertically as each layer is completed. 3D fabrication technologies. This process is similar to other 3D fabrication technologies in its approach in that it forms a solid component by the layer additive method. The lens. Lenses and lens terminology and lens selection based on different objects. Angle of view. Field or angle of view is a part of the scene visible with a particular lens. Lenses that provide a wide angle of view are normally called wide-angle lenses. Lenses with a narrow angle of view are called telephoto lenses or telelenses for short. The angle of view is commonly measured horizontally, vertically, or diagonally. Lenses. Focal length. Parallel incident light transmitted into a convex lens converges to a point on the optical axis. This point is the focal point of the lens, normally by the image sensor. The distance between the principal point in the optical system and the focal point is referred to as the focal length. For a single thin lens, the focal length is equal to the distance between the center of the lens and the focal point. The focal length of a lens determines its angle of view at a given distance. A lens with a short focal length has wide-angle characteristics, while a lens with long focal length has telescopic characteristics. Lenses. Calculating the focal length. Calculating the focal length is of importance, especially when using a lens with a fixed focal length. Since the focal length is fixed, so is the field or angle of view. To calculate the optimal focal length lens for an application, you will need the following information. How far you are from the scene you want to view. The horizontal size of the image sensor in your camera. You can now apply it to the formula below. F equals D into I by W, where F is the lens focal length, D is distance to scene, I is the image sensor width in millimeters, and W is the width of scene. Any unit of measure can be applied so long as it is uniformly used for every parameter. Lenses. Depth of field. The focus ring on a lens is usually adjusted so that the object of interest within the scene is sharp. Up to a certain point, objects in front of this setting and behind it are in focus as well. This zone of focus is referred to as a depth of field. As objects get further outside of the depth of field, either further from the lens or closer to it, they will lose focus. Lenses. Aperture. Another important factor affecting the image a lens produces is the lens aperture, the opening of a lens. It indicates a measure of the lens's light-gathering capability. Lenses. Lens iris. The amount of light that falls on the surface of the image sensor needs to be within certain limits for optimum performance. Too much light and the image is overexposed or washed out. Too little and the resulting image is too dark, losing detail in some parts of the scene. The lens iris is used to control the amount of light falling on the sensor. Lenses can incorporate fixed, manually adjustable, or automatic irises. Lenses. Lens elements. Lenses have traditionally been shaped to the arc of a sphere, spherical lenses, which has the effect of causing some distortion of image at the very edges of the lens, as well as reducing its light-gathering capability. A spherical lens allows the edges of the lens to be less curved, producing a larger area of accurate image and allowing transmission of a greater amount of light. Aspherical lenses can therefore reduce distortion and permit cameras to operate at lower light levels. Lenses. Mount standards. The two most common mount standards for CCTV lenses are called C and CS mount. Lenses. Sensor dependency. Image sensors are measured in sizes, such as 1x4, 1x3, 1x2, 2x3, and 1 inch. These sizes are not the diagonal length of the CCD, they are sizing standards actually originating back to the 1950s and the time of Vidicon tubes. Lenses. Types. Wide angle. Wide-angle lenses have a large angle of view, giving a larger view. Telephoto lenses. Telephoto is a term used to describe lenses that have a high focal number length, causing the reproduced image to appear larger than human eye reproduction. They are normally used when the surveillance object is either small or far from the camera. Lenses. Types. Varifocal. Varifocal lenses are more expensive than fixed focus. They are, however, easier to use, set up and change. It is much simpler to obtain the correct view of a scene when it is possible to vary the focal length and therefore the angle of view of the lens. Zoom lenses are the next step from variable focal length lenses and offer the greatest functionality. Their focal length and field of view can be continuously adjusted throughout the range with maintained focus. They are often motorized, allowing remote control, and are often used by the operator to closely examine critical areas of the scene. The term zoom ratio is often used when describing the capacity of zoom lenses. It is the ratio of starting focal length, wide, to the ending focal length, telephoto, of a zoom lens. A 10-inch zoom will magnify the image at the wide end by 10 times. Example, 10-inch zoom lenses, 8 mm to 80 mm, 12 mm to 120 mm. Special lenses. Fish eye. Extremely wide-angle lenses are called fish eye lenses. They are expensive as the front lens has to be very large. Lenses are polished and it is difficult to get such a large surface good. Special lenses. Pinhole. Pinhole lenses are primarily used for covert surveillance. They have a very small 1 to 3 mm opening in the front, which makes it possible to mount them behind very small holes, making them virtually undetectable. Straight and angled models are available to allow flexible mounting positions. Due to the small frontal opening, pinhole lenses can't gather as much light as conventional lenses, and so their use dictates that the scene illumination is better than would otherwise be required. Digital imagery. A digital image is a numeric representation, normally binary, of a two-dimensional image. Depending on whether the image resolution is fixed, it may be of vector or raster type. By itself, the term digital image usually refers to raster images or bitmapped images. Raster. Raster images have a finite set of digital values called picture elements or pixels. The digital image contains fixed number of rows and columns of pixels. Pixels are the smallest individual element in an image, holding quantized values that represent the brightness of a given color at any specific point. Typically, the pixels are stored in computer memory as a raster image or raster map, a two-dimensional array of small integers. These values are often transmitted or stored in a compressed form. Vector. Vector images result from mathematical geometry. Vector. In mathematical terms, a vector consists of a point that has both direction and length. Often both raster and vector elements will be combined in one image. For example, in the case of a billboard with text, vector, and photographs, raster. Movies which use vector graphics quite often become hits, attracting huge audiences. Image viewing. Image viewer software displays images. Web browsers can display standard Internet image formats, including GIF, JPEG, and PNG. Some can show SVG format, which is a standard W3C format. Some viewers offer a slideshow utility to display a sequence of images. Early digital fax machines, such as the Bartlane cable picture transmission system, preceded digital cameras and computers by decades. The first picture to be scanned, stored, and recreated in digital pixels was displayed on the Standards Eastern Automatic Computer (SEAC) at NIST. Scaling image methods. Nearest neighbor interpolation. One of the simpler ways of doubling its size is nearest neighbor interpolation, replacing every pixel with 4 pixels of the same color. Method 1. The resulting image is larger than the original and preserves all original detail but has undesirable jaggedness. The diagonal lines of the W, for example, now show the characteristic stairway shape. Method 2. For magnifying computer graphics with low resolution and a few colors, usually from 2 to 256 colors, better results will be achieved by HQX or other pixel art scaling algorithms. These produce sharp edges and maintain high level of detail. Scanning analog photographs. Somewhere in your home, there is a box of old analog photographs you probably want digital copies of. Unless you know how to use your scanner correctly, the image quality can turn out poor. Here's how to get the best results. If your memories are important to you, then it's worth taking the time to do them right. Now we are going to look at the largely overlooked tools and methods that will give you the best possible quality out of a scan of a less than perfect photo. We'll see how to make the most of the scanning software and how to use graphic programs to make the image look better than the original photograph. Method 1. Because every scanner driver is different, we'll be starting out with Windows Fax and Scan, a program included with Windows 7 that'll scan for you even if you don't have any other program to capture images. With most Epson scanners, this is a fairly common program and should give you an idea of the kind of fine-tuning you can do with the software bundled with your scanner. Method 2. Windows Fax and Scan is a basic stripped-down program that will perform the most basic functions of scanning if you can't get your scanner driver to work or haven't installed it. Method 3. Your options are pretty threadbare. 300 dpi is a good pixel density to scan at for printing. And while the difference between color and grayscale is obvious, keep in mind that black and white is actually a single color mode. All edges will be jaggy and no anti-aliasing is allowed. This is a good mode for scanning line drawings but horrid for photos. Use color or grayscale for best results. Method 4. Straightening photographs smears the pixels and can result in a loss of resolution, so scan your photographs square to the edge of the flat bed lip. In addition to this, since we are going to learn about making adjustments pre-scan, we are going to only scan one image at a time. It's more or less impossible to properly adjust 3 images at a time. They'll have drastically different shadows, highlights, and midtones. Even the automatic adjustments made with the scanner will likely be more accurate if images are scanned one at a time. We can also convert the analog photographs into digital using Photoshop software. Features of DSLR, video, and still cameras. Introduction to digital photography. Digital SLR or DSLR. An overview of digital camera technology, basic photographic techniques. SLR, single lens reflex. Have larger sensors resulting in greater image quality. Tend to favor manual control, lacking many automatic settings found on P and S. Much larger and heavier. Ability to interchange system lenses. The digital sensor works. Each digital image is made from millions of tiny squares known as pixels. Essentially, an image is recorded by tiny micro-lenses pixels which make up the camera sensor. Digital sensors compared. A digital sensor is essentially made up of millions of tiny micro-lenses pixels. Pixels are analog devices which record light and color data. Larger sensors contain larger pixels which are much better at collecting this data. Digital camera features and technologies. More MP does not always mean a better picture. Digital image dimensions do not equal print dimensions. A full quality image from an 8 megapixel camera will produce a digital image measuring approximately 9 into 14 inches, but printing standards say that you should not print to photo quality any larger than 8 into 10. Movement compensation. The camera's ability to correct small movements by the user while taking a picture in order to reduce the blur caused by camera shake. Very useful in low light or telephoto situations. Represented differently by different companies. Nikon, VR, vibration reduction. Canon, IS, image stabilization. Pentax, SR, shake reduction. Sony, SSS, super steady shot. Dust reduction. Dust is more of a problem in DSLRs due to changing lenses. Once dust gets under your sensor, it can be difficult to remove. Dust reduction is essentially a mechanism which shakes the camera sensor to free any clinging dust particles. Special anti-static coatings or filters may also be used. Live view. The ability to use the LCD screen on the camera the same way you would use a viewfinder. Shots can be composed even while holding the camera away from your face. Originally only a feature in P&S, DSLRs now use live view also. Facial recognition. Camera detects faces in your frame based on color, contrast change, etc. Focus is automatically adjusted, so detail in faces is high. Color and contrast are automatically adjusted to create pleasing skin tones. Getting a good shot. There are hundreds of factors which can make a photo good. It is still a relative term, and good to one person may not be good to someone else. Exposure. A correct or good exposure occurs when you maintain as much detail as possible in both the very bright parts, highlights, as well as the very dark parts, shadows of an image. There are three factors which influence the exposure of your image: shutter speed, aperture, ISO. Shutter speed refers to how long the shutter is open, exposing the image sensor to light, how long the camera sees the picture. Aperture. An aperture is defined as a hole or opening through which light is admitted. Inside the camera lens is a system of blades which open and close to increase or decrease the opening through which light passes into the camera. ISO. The light sensitivity of the sensor. High ISO value means the sensor will be more sensitive to light, meaning it will take less light to get the right exposure, similar to film speeds in 35 mm format. Typically ranges from 100 to 1600. Newer digital cameras have a higher range, up to 64,000. Using high ISO values causes the sensor to produce much more heat, which creates digital noise in images. Noise is similar to film grain and causes loss of fine detail in images. It is more visible in dark parts of an image and is generally more noticeable when displayed on screen than in print. Exposure evaluation. Exposing each photograph properly is of utmost importance in order to get the best print possible from this one image. This is because whether you use film or digital capture, your original film or digital image contains all the information you'll ever get of the scene you photographed. Gray cards. A gray card is a card painted medium gray. These cards are available from Kodak. Gray cards have a precisely 18% reflectivity, meaning they reflect 18% of the light that falls on them. Overexposure. Overexposure is a process of exposing a photograph more than what your light meter, either in camera or handheld, tells you to. In other words, you are not following what your camera is telling you. Underexposure. Underexposure gives you a darker image. Features for realization of different effects. Backlights eliminates dark shadows when light is coming from behind a subject or when the subject is in the shade. The built-in flash automatically fires to fill in the shadows. Beach, snow. Beach, snow, and sunlit water scenes. Exposure and white balance are set to help prevent the scene from becoming washed out looking. Fireworks. Shutter speed and exposure are set for shooting fireworks. Pre-focusing and use of tripod recommended. Landscape. Take photos of wide scenes. Camera automatically focuses on a distant object. Macro. Take close-up shots of small objects, flowers, and insects. Lens can be moved closer to the subject than in other modes. Hold the camera steady or use a tripod. Night portrait. Take photos of a subject against a night scene. The built-in flash and red eye reduction are enabled. Shutter speeds are low. Night scene. Photograph nightscapes. Pre-programmed to use slow shutter speeds. Party. Take photos in a dim lit room. Exposure and shutter speed are automatically adjusted for room brightness. Captures indoor background lighting or candlelight. Hold the camera very steady when using this mode. Portrait. Main subject is clearly focused and the background is out of focus. Has less depth of field. Best when taking shots outside during the day. Shoot using a mid to long telephoto lens. Stand close to your subject within the recommended camera range, and when possible, select an uncomplicated background that is far from the subject. Sports, also called kids and pets. Take photos of a fast-moving subject. Fast shutter speeds freeze the action. Best when shots are taken in bright light. Pre-focusing recommended. Sunset. Take photos of sunsets and sunrises. Helps keep the deep hues in the scene. The metering system within a camera measures the amount of light in a frame and determines the best exposure. Many cameras have more than one metering mode, and each evaluates a scene in a different way. Essentially, by changing the metering mode, you are telling the camera to evaluate the scene in a different way. Conclusion. In this chapter, we have covered the following in detail: conventional photography, file formats and quality settings, digital exposure, creative control of aperture and shutter speeds, exposure evaluation, low light photography, controlling white balance and other aspects in camera, composition and lens choice, digital imagery, digital image scale, scanning analog photographs, features of DSLR video and still cameras, use of features for realization of different effects.